Hello everyone, I'm bringing you a video today which is something of a follow-up to the Mannequin of the Month which has just been, and that is a video looking at 17th century bandoliers. Now this is a topic which may not be of interest to all who frequently watch my videos. Obviously it's well outside the normal area I cover on the channel, which is generally 20th century. So I quite understand if this isn't your cup of tea, but hopefully it will be of interest to some. And what we're going to talk about here are bandoliers in general for ammunition carriage, how they developed to a degree as well, and we'll have a look at three different reproductions, all from the same manufacturer, Graham Webb over at Going Bang, who makes superb replicas of 17th century British bandoliers, which will be the focus of what we're talking about here, of course. My main interest and main focus of sort of 17th century warfare is the English Civil War or British Civil Wars. Obviously there were several different parts of the conflict, or several different wars which are all sort of lumped together in that period, a bit like the Napoleonic Wars. Obviously there were various different conflicts ongoing, and the same is true of the British Civil Wars, for want of a better term. And that's my main focus of interest, obviously my main area of interest when it comes to warfare from this period, and therefore obviously these three bandoliers are of replicas of those of British origin. But that's not to say that a lot of the information here isn't applicable to what was going on the continent as well, in terms of the equipment that was issued and so forth. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. We'll have a look at these three replicas in some detail and talk a little bit about the development of these bandoliers as a method of carrying ammunition. So I'm filming this during Storm Amy, I think it is, that's hit the UK. So there may be some wind noise in the background. I'm filming in the back room, and there's a bit of a whistle from the wood burner in the back room, so you may hear that in the background, just to explain if you do hear that. The first bandolier we're going to have a look at here is a recreation of a new model army contract bandolier, so obviously appearing in 1645, pretty much slap bang in the middle of the 17th century. But these would have been made to a typical pattern of the period, but it's useful in that we know the specification for these. The new model contract books survive, and therefore the specification for these is basically known, and there are extant examples, or I think at least one good extant example in what was the Tower collection, is now at the Royal Armouries in Leeds. And Graham, who reproduced this, went and inspected that, and the reproduction of this is based closely on that original example. So from that perspective, this is a very good reproduction and a useful aid in talking about bandoliers of this period, and it's why I thought we'd focus on this as the first one to look at. So you can see a general layout of this here. You have a leather strap, which is a little over 1 inch wide, passes over the shoulder where you have this section of leather stitched on, which we mentioned in the video in Mannequin of the Month. This is not really to spread the load on the shoulder, it's more of a place to rest the musket when the musket is carried over the shoulder. So you have that leather pad stitched on there, but stitched in place as you can see, which means it's a nice comfortable fit on the shoulder. And then the bandolier, the strap of the bandolier has holes to allow the strings to be attached to suspend the charges or powder boxes, which we have here. You have a row on the front and then 3 more which hang to the rear when this is worn. So the hip is basically here. These are behind the hip. The rest of them are in front across the chest and the middle torso. And then round on the hip, you have the pouch here for the musket balls, potentially wadding as well. And suspended below that, you have the primer. And this is effectively one of the boxes, but with a modified cap, which includes a small pouring spout to allow a small amount of the fine priming powder to be poured out from the top there. Now the things that specifically make this a new model bandolier are the blue painted boxes, you can see here clearly enough, and the blue and white string which is used to suspend these from the bandolier. And these were specified. It's my presumption that this is sort of an early form of ordnance marking. It's obviously clear that these were new model bandoliers, property of Parliament, etc., etc., from the very fact that they were produced in these distinctive colours. And that is noted in the contract books. It's all part of uniform in that regard, in that it's sort of an identifying factor for the fact that these were new model issued bandoliers. And obviously it also easily marks them out as property of Parliament in a way that can't easily be erased, I guess you could say. So 2 points there, really. You can see here that in addition to the strings coming down, there are actually little metal rings that hold these together, and that does just help to stop these from flopping around as much as they would otherwise. It does keep them a little bit more secure in that regard, and you see there's a ring between each set of strings there, and the same for the charge which carried round to the rear here, the powder box to the rear. Something I will mention here, because I'm sure it'll come up in the comments if I don't mention it here. It may well come up in the comments anyway. These, at the time of the English Civil War, the mid-17th century, were not referred to as apostles, the 12 apostles. That is a later term which was introduced. It is not a contemporary term, and I will therefore not be using it. As you can see, we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 charges on this bandolier. Not all bandoliers had 12. Some had more, some had less. Bandoliers were not only used for military purposes, they were also used for hunting, and they commonly carried fewer of these boxes on them. So, as I say, the term 12 apostles to refer to these is very much post-dates the middle 17th century, and from that point of view is not really appropriate to refer to these in the context we're talking about. Each of these boxes carried a powder charge enough to fire the musket once, and obviously in addition to that you required a measure of priming powder from the primer here. Now, why do you require a separate primer? The black powder at this time was very coarse, and a large quantity of it was needed to fire an individual musket ball. Obviously muskets were quite heavy caliber, and from that perspective you needed a large charge of powder. These are pretty voluminous, they're actually bored out inside rather than being drilled. So the inside of this, where these swell out, it's not just a parallel hole running down, they are bored out inside. So they do good quantity. That was very coarse, and the priming powder had to be ground finer in order for it to be caught by either the burn reason you need the primer on bandoliers of this period, and you see that on the mid is issuing powder bags, possibly with cartridges carried in them, but cartridges for muskets of this period are huge. Graham, the chap who manufactures these, I've been informed, has done some experiments where he has made cartridges with the coarse powder that would have been used at the time, the correct measure of powder, and they are enormous and clumsy things to carry. And from that perspective, the bandolier remained the standard way of carrying ammunition, basically right the way through the end of the 17th century and into the early 18th century as well. You still see bandoliers in use. Certainly the Army of the Restoration, the English Army of the Restoration, used bandoliers for some considerable time after the Restoration, effectively. So something important to mention here, obviously cartridge boxes do appear and then would remain the standard way of carrying ammunition right the way through the 18th century and well into the 19th century. But prior to that, bandoliers were the standard method and remained in use until cartridge boxes basically made them obsolete. And one of the reasons for that is an improvement in the powder, which we'll get onto in just a minute, because that also affected the design of bandoliers. So that's a new model bandolier here. We'll have a quick look at the example which was on the mannequin for Mannequin of the Month as well. We'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail. It is very similar to this, but we'll talk a little bit about the metal lids for the boxes on that example. And we'll also talk about a late 17th century bandolier as well, to show how the design of these evolved over time. One final thing I'll mention about this, because it'll be easy to compare on the follow-up of the next bandolier we're going to look at. You'll notice here the way these are strung onto the leather strap of the bandolier. The string is tied off here, runs up through the two holes behind on the inside face here. You can see it just passes back down through the next hole and is knotted again on this side. This is one way these were strung, possibly. It's difficult to tell from extant examples because they could well have been restrung and probably would have to be restrung at some point during their lifespan, those that have survived through to today. So exactly how these were strung onto the bandolier is not entirely clear, but it is something we can look at on the next one. They're actually strung up slightly differently, as we'll see. So we'll have a look at that second bandolier now. So the second bandolier we're going to have a look at here is near identical in form to that we've just looked at, but there are detail differences. Obviously, in terms of the leatherwork, you have that shoulder pad there, as we've already mentioned. The construction of that is very similar. Graham basically working from extant examples, so trying to replicate something which would have been typical of the period. Something we didn't mention in the previous bandolier we were looking at, the new model contract bandolier, this is identical in the way that this pouch is attached. It's laced in place onto the bandolier, as you can see there, onto the leather strap of the bandolier rather. The string then runs down through the base of this to attach the primer, which I've managed to just pull the stopper out of that from trapping it underneath there. But that's how the pouch which carries the musket balls is attached onto the bandolier. So something we didn't mention previously. This closes with a leather flap with a rolled leather toggle there, as you can see. And again, the musket balls will be carried in there. The primer is near identical, but obviously these are bare oiled wood. Believe they were to be 3 times dipped in oil. I think that's actually in the new model contract book, so would probably have been typical for good quality bandoliers of the time, obviously to render them, to treat the wood and render them waterproof. And you can see here, we again have that different stopper at the top here, different tops, so this can be removed to fill this with priming powder, and in which case this section here is similar to the other boxes, but once that's put in place you then have this fine smaller stopper at the top which can be removed to allow the priming powder to be pulled out of this smaller opening here in a more controlled manner when priming the pan of the musket. Again, we have the set of 12 charges or powder boxes here, as you can see. These differ not only in their finish, but also in the caps of these. I'll just bring one up, which is a little close to the camera here. These have pewter tops, which have been rendered slightly gold from the oil that was used to treat these. But you can see these are actually made in 2 pieces. So you have a section here forming the cylinder, and then the top is actually soldered in place. So the soldered seam here making up the cylinder, and then the flat top on these with the holes for the strings is then soldered onto this. And these are replicated based on those which have been found on battlefields, English Civil War battlefields. So they are as accurate as you can get in that regard. Now, there's some debate about whether these may have been field repairs, obviously using a low melting point metal like pewter, you could do that in theory, or whether there were bandoliers made with these. It makes sense because having a metal cap means there's some weight to hold it in place, but it's less likely to get jammed or with swelling or moisture and so forth. So from that perspective, these work very well. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to pick up this bandolier with this slightly different design, is that it's an interesting design detail that can be talked about. And as I say, there's certainly extant examples of these which have been dug up on various battlefields, and Graham has directly copied those in the way these have been manufactured. You'll notice these boxes are strung onto the leather strap of the bandolier in a different manner than we saw with the new model example. And this is another example of doing this, another way of doing this, which can be seen on existing examples. And that is with a loop of cord around the back of the charge powder box there, as you can see, which then runs up each side and is tied off the back here on the bandolier strap. So that's another method of doing it. It works equally well. Just another detail difference to mention when looking at this compared to the new model bandolier we were looking at a moment ago. So it's another example of one of these. We'll move on now to have a look at a late 17th century bandolier. So this is an example of a reproduction of a late 17th century bandolier, and for the most part it has the features we looked at on the earlier 17th century examples we were talking about a moment ago. It has 12 charged or powder boxes. It still has the pouch down here which would sit on the hip for carrying musket balls, somewhat larger in this instance, but fastens in the same way. It's on a much wider belt, of course, and because of that, to make this V-shape there's no primer hung beneath this. And the reason for that is that the powder by this point is of sufficient quality that a small amount from each of the main charges can be used to prime the pan, and then the rest can be used to charge the musket. So from that perspective, it makes things a little bit easier, not fumbling around handling another bottle basically on the bandolier to prime the musket. You can do it all from the powder carried in these. So the primer's disappeared. Other than that, the loading procedure from one of these would be very, very similar. Obviously, you're still having to load powder and ball separately. Around this time, cartridges are becoming more common, and the cartridge box starts to make an appearance at the very end of the 17th century into the early 18th century, and basically kills off the bandolier. But for the Tangier garrison, the early English army, the bandolier was still generally the way ammunition was carried. And then, of course, there was a transitional period as well. So it's quite an interesting period in that regard. By the end of the 17th century, early 18th century, you're seeing a move away from clearly identifiable 17th century tactics and 17th century weaponry and equipment such as this and matchlock muskets, to the more general use of firelocks and the introduction of cartridge boxes, which would basically be very similar in terms of the equipment used and the weapon used through to through into the 19th century, of course, because it's only with percussion technology really that there's any great step forward in that regard. And then, of course, with rifled weapons as well. But cartridge boxes would remain in service for many years after the introduction of those weapons. So it really does set the pattern. The changes in the late 17th, early 18th century really set the pattern for many, many years of military equipment going forward. Of course, the bayonet, the introduction of the bayonet finally kills off the pike as well. So it's quite an interesting transitional period and would set the stage for the kind of warfare, linear warfare and so forth, that would be seen for a very long time thereafter. With some, obviously, developmental changes, but it really does set the pattern for many, many years to come, that transitional period at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. So quite interesting from that point of view, or certainly I find it so. As I say, this is a late 17th century bandolier. Hopefully you found it interesting contrasting this to the earlier two examples we looked at, the new model contract and the other example. Prior to that, of course, bandoliers have been in use for many years. Certainly in the 16th century they were used, and going back even further with use of the arquebus and so forth, ammunition was carried in a similar manner. Certainly medieval illustrations, late medieval illustrations show similar methods of carrying charges from a strap around the body. Whether they could be truly called bandoliers or not, certainly it's a method of carrying ammunition which evolved somewhat over time, but as I say, didn't change wholesale until the end of the 17th century into the early 18th century. So hopefully it's been interesting looking at these three examples of 17th century bandoliers. So as I say, possibly not to everyone's taste. I know that obviously the 17th century content on the channel doesn't necessarily get quite as many views as the 20th century stuff. Obviously there's then a huge gap that I don't cover in terms of military history, but I may well have some content dealing with that going forward, which hopefully will be interesting as well, sort of the intervening several hundred years. But as I say, hopefully you have found this interesting, those who did decide to watch. Hopefully it has been informative. And if you're into sort of the history from this period, I can certainly recommend putting some money aside and picking up one of these bandoliers, sort of for interest's sake, if nothing else, even if you're not a reenactor. As I say, I generally have them for display. I don't do a huge amount of 17th century reenacting, a little bit with my friend David at Wythenshawe Hall, but other than that, these are frequently used sort of as display items on mannequins and so forth, because as I say, it's quite an interesting era for me, and it adds something more. Two mannequins set up in the front room now. One generally has 20th century militaria on it, depending on what's covered on Mannequin of the Month, and the other one routinely has 17th century kit. So that's the reason I have these. So as I say, I do hope you found it interesting. If you have and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below, and that will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you'd like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as I always say, a huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those two methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, Bye for now.